Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, my name is Ine Sintia. I'm from class 4B English Education Department. In this occasion, I'm going to explain the material of Introduction to Literature course, and it is about theoretical approaches to literature, yaitu teori-teori tentang pendekatan-pendekatan pada literatur. Okay, the first is text-oriented approach, yaitu pendekatan yang berorientasi pada teks. The text-oriented approach is primarily concerned with questions of the materiality of text, including editions of manuscripts, analysis of language and style, and the formal structure of literary works. Jadi, pendekatan yang berorientasi pada teks ini merupakan sebuah metode yang digunakan untuk menganalisis suatu literatur berdasarkan teks itu sendiri, termasuk dari edisi dari manuskrip, kemudian analisis dari bahasa dan gaya bahasanya, kemudian dari struktur formal teks literatur itu sendiri. Many of the modern schools and methodologies in literary criticism adhere to text-oriented approaches and thereby indirectly continue to apply mechanism rooted in the above-mentioned primordial textual sciences of religion, legal practice, and divination. All these traditions place the main emphasis on the internal textual aspects of a literary work. Jadi dalam pendekatan ini masih menggunakan primordial textual sciences seperti agama, kemudian legal practice, and divination or ramalan. All this tradition places the main emphasis on the internal textual aspects of a literary work. Jadi agama, kemudian legal practice, and divination atau ramalan tersebut merupakan internal textual aspek atau aspek internal dari teks literatur itu sendiri. Extra textual factors concerning the author, his or her biography, other works, and then audiences, race, class, gender, age, education, or larger context seperti historical, social, and political conditions are deliberately excluded from the analysis. Jadi pada pendekatan ini faktor ekstra atau faktor luar seperti penulis tentang biografinya, kemudian audiens atau pembaca, kemudian konteks yang lebih luas seperti sejarah, sosial, sejarah politik, itu dengan sengaja tidak termasuk dalam analisis pada pendekatan ini. Although the text serves as the focal point of every interpretive method, some schools privilege other aspects such as biographical information concerning the author, problems of reception, and the like, which are only indirectly related to the literary work as such. Next, there are some text-oriented approaches. Jadi ada beberapa pendekatan yang berorientasi pada teks, yaitu first, philology. In literary criticism, the term philology generally denotes approaches which focus on editorial problems and the reconstruction of text. Philology, which experienced its heyday in the Renaissance with the rediscovery of ancient authors, the inventions of the printing press, and the desire for correct editions of text, remained one of the dominant schools into the 19th century. Jadi dalam literary criticism, istilah philology ini merupakan suatu pendekatan yang mana fokus terhadap masalah-masalah editorial dan rekonstruksi dari teks itu sendiri. Nah, philology ini merupakan suatu pengalaman dari seorang yang bernama Heyday pada masa Renaissance. Informed by the rise of modern science, these philological approaches try to incorporate advanced empirical methodologies into the study of literature. Jadi philology ini merupakan sebuah pengetahuan yang modern, yang mana pendekatan philology ini mencoba untuk menggabungkan metodologi empiris pada tingkat lanjut kepada study of literature atau pembelajaran literatur. Next, rhetoric and stylistics. In addition to traditional editorial problems, today's text-oriented schools focus primarily on aspects of form. It is textual and narrative structure, point of view, and plot patterns, and then style. It is rhetorical figures, choice of words or diction, syntax, and matter. Jadi pada pendekatan yang berorientasi pada teks pada saat ini, fokus utamanya terhadap aspek-aspek formal, yaitu tekstual dan struktur naratif, kemudian point of view atau sudut pandang, kemudian plot patterns atau pola plot atau alur. Dan kemudian style atau gaya yang mana terdiri dari rhetorical figures, yaitu retoris, gaya retoris, kemudian choice of words, pemilihan kata atau diksi, syntax, dan matter. Jadi pada pendekatan rhetoric and stylistic ini berfokus pada aspek formal dan style atau gaya. Together with theology and grammar, rhetoric remained the dominant textual discipline for almost 2,000 years. Since ancient Greco-Roman culture treasured public speech, rhetoric compiled a number of rules and techniques for efficient composition and powerful oratory. Although rhetoric was mainly concerned with teaching effectively how to influence the masses, it soon developed, as did the interpretation of holy and legal texts, into a theoretical academic discipline in its attempt to classify systematically and investigate elements of human speech. Rhetoric laid the foundation for current linguistics and literary criticism. Next, formalism and structuralism. The terms formalism and structuralism encompass a number of schools in the first half of the 20th century whose main goal lies in the explication of the formal and structural patterns of literary text. This emphasis on the intrinsic and structural aspects of a literary work deliberately distinguished itself from older traditions, above all the biographical literary criticism of the 19th century, which were primarily concerned with extrinsic or extra-textual features in their analysis of literature. The consecutive schools of Freudian formalism, the Prague school of structuralism, new criticism, and post-structuralism find a common denominator despite their respective idiosyncrasies in their general attempts to explain levels of content in relation to formal and structural dimensions of text. Jadi pada formalism and structuralism approach atau pendekatan formalism and structuralism ini, pendekatannya dilakukan dengan menganalisis teks formal dan struktur teks literatur itu sendiri. Now, this emphasis on the intrinsic and structural aspects of literary work. Jadi, pendekatan ini menekankan pada aspek struktur intrinsik dari teks literatur itu sendiri. Next, pendekatan yang selanjutnya yaitu New Criticism. Largely independent of European formalism and structuralism, New Criticism established itself as the dominant school of literary criticism in the English-speaking academic community during the 1930s and 1940s. Literary critics such as William K. Wimsatt, Alan Tate, and J.C. Ransom represented this school, which maintained its status as an orthodox method for more than 3 decades. The central features of New Criticism, whose name deliberately negates preceding critical methods, are best understood in contrast to the academic approaches in literary studies which were prevalent in the preceding years. New Criticism objects to evaluate critique, source studies, investigations of socio-historical background, and the history of motifs. It also counters author-centered biographical or psychological approaches as well as the history of reception. Its main concern is to free literary criticism of extrinsic factors and thereby shift the center of attention to the literary text itself. New criticism disapproves of what are termed the affective fallacy and the intentional fallacy in traditional analysis of text. The term affective fallacy stigmatizes interpretive procedures which take into account the emotional reaction of the reader as an analytical tool. Jadi New Criticism ini merupakan suatu pendekatan yang mana objek-objek dari New Criticism ini adalah untuk mengevaluasi atau mengkritik, kemudian mengkritik sumber pembelajaran, kemudian menginvestigasi background atau latar belakang socio-historical dan sejarah dari motif dalam sebuah teks literatur. The term intentional fallacy is applied to interpretive methods which try to recover the original intention or motivation of an author while writing a particular text. In its analysis, new criticism consequently focuses on phenomena such as multiple meaning, paradox, irony, wordplay, puns, or rhetorical figures, which, as the smallest distinguishable elements of literary work, from interdependent links with the overall context, a central term often used synonymously with new criticism is close reading. Jadi istilah intentional fallacy adalah diaplikasikan untuk menginterpretasi metode-metode yang mana mencoba untuk menemukan penemuan yang asli atau motivasi dari seorang penulis terhadap tulisannya pada setiap bagian-bagian dalam teksnya. Kemudian dalam analisis pendekatan ini atau new criticism ini berfokus pada fenomena-fenomena seperti multiple meaning atau makna ganda, kemudian paradoks, ironi, kemudian wordplay atau permainan kata, puns or rhetorical figur retoris dari teks itu sendiri. Next, semiotics and deconstruction. Semiotics and deconstruction are the most recent trends in text-oriented literary theory of the 1970s and 1980s, which regards a text as a system of signs. The basis for these complex theoretical constructs is the linguistics model of Ferdinand de Saussure. The Swiss linguist starts from the assumption that language functions through representation, in which a mental image is verbally manifested of or represented. Jadi pada pendekatan semiotik dan dekonstruksi ini, pendekatan ini berfokus pada semiotik, yaitu merupakan suatu ilmu dalam linguistik yang mana membahas tentang makna dari setiap teks. Jadi setiap teks itu pasti memiliki makna tersendiri. Kemudian satu teks tidak bisa memiliki makna yang sama atau konteks yang sama dalam situasi yang berbeda. Next, the second approach is author-oriented approaches atau pendekatan yang berorientasi pada penulis. In the 19th century, before the major formalist, structuralist theories of the 20th century, biographical criticism evolved and became a dominant movement. This author-oriented approach established a direct link between the literary text and the biography of the author. Dates, facts, and events in an author's life are juxtaposed with the literary elements of his or her works in order to find aspects which connect the biography of the author with the text. Autobiographies are obviously suitable for this kind of approach, which compares the fictional portrayal with the facts and figures from the author's life. In many cases, autobiographical material enters the fictional text in quotes. The American playwright Eugene O'Neill, for example, used veiled autobiographical elements in his play Long Day's Journey into Night. Although the characters and events in the play are supposedly fictional, they are based on real people and dramatize events from his family life. Jadi pada pendekatan yang berorientasi pada penulis ini, pendekatannya dilakukan dengan menganalisis teks tersebut melalui penulisnya. Jadi biasanya teks literatur ini masih memiliki hubungan dengan penulisnya. Dan contoh dari pendekatan ini adalah autobiografi, yaitu sebuah teks yang menjelaskan yang penulisnya itu menuliskan biografi dirinya sendiri. Next, it's still about the author-oriented approaches atau pendekatan yang berorientasi pada penulis. Author-centered approaches focus also on aspects which might have entered the text on a subconscious or involuntary level. The fact that Mary Shelley had a miscarriage during the period in which she wrote her novel Frankenstein can be related directly to the plot. According to the author-centered approaches, the central theme of the novel, the creation of an artificial human being, can be traced back to Mary Shelley's intense psychological occupation with the issue of birth at the time. Many authors wish to keep their texts fictional and their private spheres in check and hence oppose these approaches. For example, the American author J.D. Salinger, who became famous with the publication of his novel The Catcher in the Rye, has strictly refused to make public any information about his private life over the last decades. As the example from Mary Shelley's life shows, many biographical approaches also tend to employ psychological explanations. This has led to psychoanalytic literary criticism, a movement which sometimes deals with the author, but primarily attempts to illuminate general psychological aspects in a text that don't necessarily relate to the author exclusively. Okay, that's all from me. Thank you for your attention and thanks for watching. If you have a question, you can ask it when the meeting session. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.